In the quiet waterfront neighborhoods of Panama City, Florida, people still remember the day everything changed. A stay-at-home mom brutally murdered, an 8-year-old boy walking into a nightmare, a young carpenter, someone the family actually knew, suddenly becoming the prime suspect. But that was only the beginning, because this man didn't just kill, he escaped. He cut his way out of a 6th-floor window, tied bed sheets together, and crawled out of a private jail like he was in an action movie, all while awaiting trial for one of the cruelest murders the region had ever seen. And 36 years later, Florida strapped him to a gurney, making him the 18th man executed this year, a number higher than any year in the state's history. This is the story of Mark Allen Geralds, the murder of Tressa Lynn Pettibone, the decades of legal warfare that followed, and the long-awaited moment her family finally said, tomorrow, for the first time in 37 years, we don't have to worry about another appeal. February 1, 1989. A sunny afternoon in Panama City, Florida. Kids getting home from school, parents starting dinner. Nothing unusual, until 8-year-old Bart Pettibone walked through the front door of his family's home and found his mother dead on the kitchen floor. Not just stabbed, but beaten, tied up, gagged, and tortured. At least 20 agonizing minutes passed before she took her final breath, according to prosecutors. The home was ransacked, jewelry missing, designer sunglasses gone, her Mercedes nowhere to be found. In one moment, a child's world shattered. In one moment, investigators realized this wasn't random. This was targeted, personal, planned. And the clues were everywhere, just waiting for detectives to connect them. About a week before the murder, something strange happened, something no one realized was important at the time. Tressa was at the mall with Bart and his sister Blythe when they ran into a familiar face, Mark Allen Geralds, a 22-year-old carpenter who had remodeled part of their home the year before. Friendly chit-chat, nothing alarming. But then Tressa casually mentions, Kevin's out of town on business. That single sentence may have sealed her fate, because moments later, Geralds approached Bart at the arcade alone and started asking questions a stranger shouldn't ask a child. When does your dad come home? What time do you and your sister leave for school? What time do you get back? At the time, the kids thought nothing of it, but after the murder, those conversations took on a chilling new meaning. Geralds didn't just lose control. He prepared. He studied. He waited. Detectives reviewing the Pettibone home quickly realized they were dealing with a suspect who knew the layout, maybe even the routine. But the real turning point came that same afternoon, because while Tressa was lying dead on her kitchen floor, Geralds walked into a pawn shop and sold jewelry that once belonged to her, still carrying microscopic traces of her blood. He also gave a pair of designer sunglasses to a friend, sunglasses missing from the crime scene. Then police found plastic ties used to bind Tressa's wrists. Identical ties were in Gerald's car. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. He wasn't there by accident. He didn't panic. He went inside expecting to get something. Prosecutors later said he believed the family had $7,000 in cash hidden in the home, and when he couldn't find it, they say he tortured Tressa in an attempt to make her tell him where it was. One of the prosecutors described her final minutes as agonizing torture. She bled to death in her own home. By the time the evidence was laid out, there was no doubt. Geralds didn't stumble into this crime. He walked in with purpose. But even with the walls closing in, he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. In 1990, while awaiting trial at the Bay County Jail, Florida's first privately run jail, Geralds pulled off something straight out of a prison escape movie. He didn't do it alone either. The operation took planning, tools, and help. According to investigators, Gerald's wife smuggled saw blades to him during visitation. Inside his cell, he and 4 other maximum security inmates went to work, cutting through the metal window frame of their 6th-floor unit. Then came step 2, a rope made of bed sheets and blankets. When the moment came, the inmates punched out the window, slipped through the opening, and rappelled down the outside of the building, from 6 floors up. Think about that. Facing the death penalty and still saying, "I'll take my chances." But luck didn't follow him after the rope reached the ground. Most of the escapees, including Geralds, were captured within hours. And his attempt to flee didn't just fail, it destroyed any hope of sympathy from a future jury. The jailbreak became part of his story forever. When Gerald stood trial, prosecutors left nothing to imagination. The evidence, the brutality, the planning, the escape, everything stacked higher than the last. He was convicted of first-degree murder, armed robbery, burglary, kidnapping, and more. During sentencing, his lawyers tried to paint a different picture. He's young. He has bipolar disorder. He came from a broken home. He loves his wife and daughter. But the jury looked at the facts, at the 20-minute beating, at the torture, at the child who found his mother, at the escape, and decided death. His original sentence was overturned on appeal, but that didn't help him. He was resentenced to death again in 1992, and then began one of the longest legal journeys the Pettibone family could possibly imagine. 36 years. That's how long the Pettibone family had to watch courts, lawyers, judges, and politicians debate the fate of a man who had destroyed their world. Appeal after appeal, motion after motion, year after year. And even when they thought it was over, something new would appear. A new law, a new challenge, a new delay. But in 2024 and 2025, everything changed. Florida started moving fast. The state hit 18 executions in a single year, the highest in its history, more than double the previous record of 8. Another one was already scheduled for the following week. Nationally, Geralds became the 45th execution in the U.S. this year, the highest count since 2010. And when Geralds' warrant was signed, he didn't fight it. He simply told the judge, "I'm done. No more appeals." For the Pettibone family, this was the moment they had waited almost 4 decades to hear. They released a statement. "Tomorrow, when we wake up, it will be the first time in 37 years we don't have to worry about another appeal." And then came December 9th, 2025. On the evening of December 9th, Geralds was led into the death chamber at Florida State Prison. 6 p.m. He was strapped to the gurney, IV lines inserted, witnesses watching from glass windows, the room cold, quiet, sterile. When asked if he had final words, he spoke, but the name he addressed was inaudible. His final message, "I'm sorry that I missed you. I loved you every day." Those were the last words he would ever say. When the lethal drugs started flowing, he took a dozen deep breaths. His body trembled. His mouth opened and closed. And then, within minutes, he became still. Time of death, 6:15 p.m. Just like that, a 36-year chapter closed. But the story wasn't really about him. It was always about Tressa. Tressa Pettibone was a 33-year-old mother, originally from Ohio, building a life with her husband and 2 children in a beautiful waterfront neighborhood. She loved her kids fiercely enough that her daughter Blythe still posts tributes every Mother's Day. On a 2024 post she wrote, "You taught me how to be a mom. You set the bar so high." In another message, she said there's never a moment she doesn't wish her mom were here, especially when life gets heavy and she needs advice. Tressa wasn't just a victim. She was a protector, a defender, a mother who would have fought like hell for her children. And life gave the Pettibone family another cruel blow in 2022 when Tressa's son, Bart, the little boy who found her body, died suddenly at age 41. His obituary said, "He went home to be with his beloved mother and Jesus." 3 generations scarred, 3 decades of pain, but finally, A chapter closed. Mark Geralds' story is full of twists: a murder, a mall encounter that became evidence, a pawn shop visit hours after the crime, a jail escape, a resentencing, decades of appeals, and a final decision to stop fighting. But at the center of everything was Tressa, a mother whose life was taken in a moment of cruelty and whose family had to keep living in the aftermath. On December 9th, 2025, they finally got what they had been waiting 36 years for: closure. No more appeals, no more delays, no more fear that something might change. Just the quiet, heavy finality of justice, long delayed, but finally delivered. And for a family that spent nearly 4 decades grieving, remembering, and fighting, that meant everything. Imagine a man who lived 2 completely different lives. To some people, he was a polite, hard-working pizza manager, the kind of guy who'd hand you extra toppings just because you looked stressed. But to others, specifically more than a dozen terrified women in Tennessee, he was something much darker. Someone who prowled through neighborhoods at night, slipping through windows, and leaving entire communities on edge for months. This is the story of Wayne Nichols, the red-haired stranger with a past so violent that Tennessee spent nearly 4 decades trying to reach one final decision about what to do with him. And when December 11th, 2025 arrived, that decision finally caught up with him. Before Nichols became the man who terrified Chattanooga, he was a kid who barely survived his own home. And when I say home, I don't mean a place with memories of cartoon cereal, birthday balloons, and a mom who packed your lunch with little notes. No, his childhood was more like a horror movie where no one bothered to roll the credits. He was born on December 31st, 1960, New Year's Eve, the day the world celebrates fresh starts. Ironically, his was already on fire before it even began. His father, Mark Nichols, was the kind of man nobody would cast in a Disney film. Abusive, controlling, the type who didn't allow visitors unless they shared his exact brand of extreme church beliefs. His mother struggled with mental health issues so severe that the house felt more like a storm than a home. Imagine being a kid and having to share a bedroom with your parents and older sister. Meanwhile, your grandmother is in the other room, and 2 cousins eventually get added to that chaos after their parents drown in a tragic accident. So now the house is crammed with poverty, grief, and tension so thick you could bottle it. It gets worse. Mac exposed himself to one of the kids, Diana, and threatened her with things no child should ever hear from an adult. Investigators later believed he may have done even more than threaten. This was Harold's world, a world where violence wasn't shocking, it was normal. By the time he was 10, his mother passed away, leaving him and his sister alone with a father who should never have been around children in the first place. And when church leaders, yes, church leaders, discovered what was happening, instead of calling the police like normal humans, they cut a deal. We'll put the kids in an orphanage if you promise to keep quiet. That was the rescue plan. Harold grew up in that orphanage until 17, when he was sent back to live with his father, a man now drinking heavily, hiring sex workers, and still barely functioning as a parent. So when people ask, where did it all start? Here. It started here. But of course, a traumatic childhood doesn't excuse what he eventually became. It only explains the monster in the making. And soon, that monster would step into the real world. By the late 70s, Harold was trying to survive high school. Not doing well, just doing what he had to do. He skipped classes, wandered the streets, and rarely returned home. Eventually, he graduated, but adulthood hit him like a folding chair. He bounced around jobs and eventually did what many young people do when they feel trapped. He joined the U.S. Army in 1981. It didn't go well.
While stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, he started an affair with a married woman. They moved in together, had a daughter, and then Harold got discharged for poor performance. So naturally, he bailed, left the woman, left the baby, left the state, just vanished. He returned to Chattanooga like someone trying to respawn in life, except he spawned in the same map with the same problems and even less direction. That's when things really started moving toward the darkness he'd become known for. August 30th, 1984. Harold breaks into an apartment with the excuse of wanting to rob the place, but when one of the women inside finds him, he tries to assault her. She fights him, he flees, and police catch him a few days later. He ends up pleading guilty and gets 5 years, but only serves 18 months. A psychological evaluation claimed there was nothing unusual about him. Okay. He gets paroled, violates his parole, lands back in jail, gets released again, and moves back in with his father. By this point, he's married to a woman named Joanne, who remembers Harold being loving, gentle, and wonderful. This is something you'll see again and again with him. 2 identities, the caring husband and the violent predator. Duality at its ugliest. 1987. Police arrest him again after a woman reports a man lurking near her home with a knife. It was Harold. He spends about a year in county jail this time. Then June 1988 rolls around, he's free again, and on the surface, calm, working at Godfather's Pizza, married, seemingly stable. But that's exactly when he started spiraling into something far worse than anything in his past. A pattern, a compulsion, a crime spree so violent that it would lock Chattanooga in fear. September 30th, 1988. 20-year-old Karen Elise Pooley is asleep in her home when Harold breaks in. He carries a piece of lumber, something blunt, brutal. He strikes her, repeatedly, then assaults her and leaves her on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her friend finds her alive the next morning, but she never wakes up again. Karen dies later that day. The entire city feels the shock, but for Harold, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Over the next 4 months, Harold attacked or attempted to attack at least a dozen women around Chattanooga. He broke into homes. He stalked neighborhoods at night. He struck fast, disappearing before anyone could process what had happened. This is when people started calling him the red-haired stranger. He had become a ghost, unnerving, unpredictable, terrifying. But here's the twist. He didn't get caught because of his crimes. He got caught because of jealousy. A man named Chris Mull was irritated that Harold was spending too much time with Mull's boyfriend. So Chris calls police and says, "Hey, maybe look at this guy." That's all it took. Police arrest Harold on January 5th, 1989, and he confesses immediately. To Karen Pooley's killing, to multiple assaults, to far more than detectives even knew about. He even confessed to his wife. Harold wasn't hiding anymore. The mask dropped.
Harold's trial began in May 1990. His lawyers tried to argue the confession video shouldn't be allowed in court. When that didn't work, he pleaded guilty. The sentencing phase was brutal. The prosecution brought every detail of Karen's death, each attack, each assault, each moment of violence. They described the terror he caused in Chattanooga. They showed the jury the patterns, the impact, the horror. The defense tried to focus on his cooperation, good behavior, and his childhood trauma. They even had a reverend testify that Harold had been under the influence of an evil spirit. The jury took less than 2 hours. Death penalty. Just like that. Harold didn't react. He accepted it, almost expected it.
Over the next 30 decades, he would file countless appeals, state appeals, federal appeals, habeas petitions, requests for resentencing, every possible legal strategy. Most were denied. A 2020 execution date got delayed because of COVID. A 2022 date was delayed because Tennessee messed up its lethal injection protocols. But in 2025, the clock finally hit zero. By early 2025, Tennessee had finalized a new lethal injection protocol. In March, the state set a new date, December 11th, 2025. Gerald had a choice, electrocution or lethal injection. He didn't choose. State law chose for him. His attorneys fought to get the protocol released. They sued the state, and a judge ordered Tennessee to hand over the documents. But none of that stopped the countdown. Religious leaders pushed for mercy. His lawyers asked for clemency. Supporters argued he had changed, that he showed remorse, that he expressed sorrow for decades. But the state didn't budge. Even Karen Pulley's sister came to witness the execution. She explained that years ago her mother had visited Gerald in prison, prayed with him, and given him a Bible. But that didn't mean their family wanted him spared. People misinterpreted kindness as forgiveness. Now it was time. Hours before the execution, Gerald ordered what might be one of the more southern last meals in recent memory. Beef brisket, coleslaw, baked potato, onion rings, deviled eggs, and cheese biscuits. A full comfort food spread, almost like someone trying to taste every memory of home he never actually had. Then 10:39 a.m. arrived. Gerald Wayne Nichols received a lethal dose of pentobarbital. His final words were simple. To everyone I've harmed, I'm sorry. To my family, know that I love you. I know where I'm going. I'm ready to go home. And just like that, a chapter Tennessee spent nearly 40 years writing came to an end. Gerald Nichols' story isn't about a man who snapped one day. It's about someone shaped by trauma, violence, and a lifetime of untreated mental collapse, who then turned around and inflicted that same horror on others. His life raises questions people still argue about. Can childhood trauma explain or only influence adult violence? Should remorse change the outcome of a death sentence? How do you compare decades of good behavior in prison with the terror of a single year of violence outside it? And maybe the hardest one, what does justice look like when both the victim and the killer came from lives filled with pain? There aren't simple answers, but this case forces people to think about them anyway. What we do know is this: a city finally got closure. A family finally saw the sentence carried out, and the man once known as the red-haired stranger took his final breath after decades of consequences catching up to him. This is the story of Gerald Wayne Nichols, a man who spent his early life surviving monsters and his later life becoming one.
On a quiet December evening in Florida, the state prepared to end the life of a man tied to 5 brutal killings. His name had faded from headlines decades earlier, but as the execution date approached, it came roaring back, along with old questions, legal arguments, and a wave of renewed debate. Frank Athen Walls wasn't just another name on death row. He was a teenager when his crimes began, a man who blended into everyday life while leaving a trail of fear across Okaloosa County. And even in his final years, his case refused to stay simple. Some saw him as a calculated predator who deserved exactly what he got. Others pointed to late-stage appeals, disputed intelligence scores, and confessions that came only when they were convenient. So how did a dishwasher from a small Florida town become one of the state's most notorious killers? And why did his story continue to spark controversy right up until the final injection? To understand that, you have to go back to where the warning signs were already there, long before anyone realized what they meant. But what happened next would shock an entire community. Frank Walls didn't arrive out of nowhere. Long before police ever knew his name, people around him noticed behavior that felt unsettling, even alarming. As a teenager, he drifted from petty crimes into darker territory, break-ins, watching young women without their knowledge, harming animals. Individually, these incidents were brushed aside. Together, they formed a pattern that only made sense later. At the time, Walls worked as a dishwasher at a local restaurant, earning just enough to stay off most people's radar. He shared a living space with others who would later admit they felt uneasy around him, not because of what he did, but because of what he talked about. According to later statements, Walls openly discussed violent fantasies, including rape and killing. Not as jokes, not as shock humor, as ideas that seemed disturbingly real to him. Still, no one reported him, no one stepped in. Despite his growing criminal record, Walls dated freely and moved through social circles with surprising ease. In one of those twists that feels unreal in hindsight, he even became romantically involved with someone connected to another man who would later be exposed as a killer himself. At the time, it meant nothing, until the first body was found. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. On March 26, 1985, Frank Walls was just 17 years old. That afternoon, he was assigned to community service on Okaloosa Island, the kind of task meant to keep a troubled teen out of real trouble. Instead, it placed him directly in the path of his first victim. 19-year-old Tommy Lou Whidden was sunbathing on the beach, enjoying a normal day in a place known for peace, not violence. She never saw it coming. Walls approached her with a knife and slashed her throat, leaving her to bleed out in the sand. There was no argument, no prolonged encounter, just sudden, irreversible violence. Afterward, he stole her car and drove away, as if nothing had happened. The vehicle was discovered the next day, abandoned behind a random building. Hours later, a passerby found Tommy's body on the beach. The community was stunned. A daylight killing in a public place shattered the illusion of safety. But there was no arrest, no suspect, no clear answers. And while fear spread quietly through the area, Frank Walls went on with his life, emboldened, unnoticed, and far from finished. Because the next time, the violence wouldn't stop with one victim. A little over a year later, the killing started again. On September 16, 1986, 24-year-old Cynthia Sue Condra was found stabbed 21 times, her body left on the side of a road in Wright, Florida. The brutality was undeniable. This wasn't panic, this was rage. Still, the connection to Tommy Lou Whidden wasn't made right away. Different location, different circumstances, another unsolved case. Then, in May of 1987, things escalated again. 47-year-old Audrey Geige lived alone in a mobile home near Fort Walton Beach. One night, someone broke in. Investigators believe Walls assaulted her and left, only to return later as if reconsidering his decision. When he came back, he stabbed her to death. After killing her, he stole a fan and a radio, small items, trophies some would later suggest. Her nude body was discovered early the next morning after a coworker grew concerned when she failed to show up for work. By this point, investigators were starting to suspect something darker was unfolding. The randomness, the escalation, the repeat violence. But before police could connect the dots, Walls committed the crime that would define him forever. And it happened in the early hours of a summer morning.
Just before dawn on July 22nd, Frank Walls broke into a mobile home at Greenwood Mobile Home Park in Ocean City. Inside were Edward Alger, a 22-year-old airman stationed at Eglin Air Force Base, and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Ann Louise Peterson. Walls didn't rush in blindly. Instead, he knocked over a fan, deliberately creating noise to wake them. When the couple stepped out to investigate, he forced Ann to restrain Edward, then bound her as well. For a brief moment, it seemed like Edward might survive. He managed to loosen his bindings and attacked Walls, fighting desperately for his life. During the struggle, Edward bit Walls's hand, causing him to drop the knife. But Walls wasn't done. He pulled out a gun and shot Edward 3 times in the head. Then he turned his attention back to Ann. After assaulting her, he shot her once. The wound wasn't fatal, so he placed a pillow over her face and fired again. When it was over, Walls calmly took cash, a worn wallet, and another fan before leaving the scene. Their bodies weren't discovered until the next day, after Edward failed to report for duty. By then, Okaloosa County was gripped with fear, and this time, Walls wouldn't slip away, because the very people closest to him finally spoke up. The day after the bodies were found, police arrested Frank Walls, tipped off by his own roommate. A search of Walls's trailer revealed something investigators would never forget. Inside were weapons of every kind: knives, ice picks, a .22 caliber pistol, ammunition, a hatchet, and a chainsaw. There were fans matching those taken from crime scenes, stolen property, burned boots, blood-stained clothing. In total, officers cataloged dozens of items that painted a disturbing picture of obsession and control. Walls initially admitted responsibility for the Alger Peterson murders, but as the legal process unfolded, his behavior became increasingly erratic. While awaiting trial, authorities reopened unsolved murders, convinced they were dealing with a serial offender. One case stood out. A fan recovered from Walls's trailer contained a fingerprint belonging to Audrey Gigi. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but instead of clarity, the case descended into controversy because the courtroom battle that followed was anything but straightforward. Before the trial even began, questions arose about Walls's mental state. Psychiatrists disagreed sharply. One claimed Walls was incompetent to stand trial. Another insisted he was exaggerating symptoms and fully understood his actions. The judge sided with the prosecution. Then came testimony that ignited outrage. A jail officer claimed Walls had admitted he was faking mental illness, a statement his defense argued violated his rights. The jury heard it anyway. The result was swift. After just 6 days, Walls was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He received death for Ann Peterson's murder and life with parole eligibility for Edward Alger's. But the case refused to stay settled because higher courts soon stepped in and everything changed. The Florida Supreme Court overturned Walls's convictions, citing issues related to his competency hearing. A new trial was ordered in a different location to avoid media influence. In 1992, a second jury reached the same conclusion. Walls was found guilty again, and the original sentences were reinstated. Soon after, DNA evidence linked him conclusively to Audrey Gigi's murder. Facing the possibility of additional death sentences, Walls made a strategic decision. He pleaded no contest to Gigi's killing and confessed to the murders of Tommy Whidden and Cynthia Condra, ensuring he would never face trial for them. Some believed this was remorse. Others believed it was control, one final way to dictate the narrative. Rumors even surfaced about a possible 6th victim, though Walls refused to cooperate further, and as years passed, his name faded into the background until a new argument emerged, one that would define his final decades. Years later, Walls launched a new defense strategy. He claimed intellectual disability. According to his attorneys, his IQ fell between 72 and 74, low enough, they argued, to make execution unconstitutional. But courts weren't convinced. Records showed Walls had scored near average on multiple IQ tests earlier in life. Judges concluded he may have intentionally underperformed in later evaluations. Appeal after appeal was denied. Even as execution neared, Walls's attorneys filed last-minute motions citing evolving legal standards and age-related cognitive development at the time of the crimes. The state rejected every argument. On November 18, 2025, the governor signed the death warrant, and in the final days, the debate reignited online, some calling the execution justice long delayed, others questioning whether every truth had been uncovered. Then, the final decision came. On December 18, 2025, Frank Athen Walls was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 6:11 p.m. His last meal was detailed and deliberate, a final reminder of the control he maintained until the very end. For Okaloosa County, the scars remain. Families lost daughters, a community lost its sense of safety, and decades later, the questions still still linger. Was this justice finally served, or a reminder of how long darkness can hide in plain sight? Because long after the execution chamber goes silent, the impact of one man's actions continues to echo, and that may be the most unsettling part of all.